Alrighty, some other key things to know about both operant and classical conditioning. Some key parts of the processes that we go through when we engage in both of these kinds of learning. So first of all, we need to talk about learning preparedness. The idea that some associations are learned more readily than others. Phobias of spiders and snakes are more common than phobias of automobiles. And responses cannot be conditioned with equal ease. So it's easier to condition, say, food with poison, but not food with light. So there are certain characteristics that we have that show how prepared we are to learn a particular behavior or a particular association. Both operant conditioning and classical conditioning have an acquisition phase. So this is when we're learning the response that we'll eventually learn. So whether we're establishing the desired response through reinforcement, and a schedule of reinforcement is really important here, or learning the association in classical conditioning. And this is when timing is really important. Continuous reinforcement helps with a faster acquisition phase. And then we have extinction, when the response or the targeted behavior stops happening, whether that's because the reinforcement stops in operant conditioning or the association stops being paired together, like in classical conditioning, and eventually the behavior becomes extinct. We can have spontaneous recovery after a period of time. Maybe the behavior or the response will come back, but it's usually weaker and for a very short period of time if the association doesn't continue or we get no reinforcement. The other thing that can happen is stimulus generalization. This is when we start responding to similar stimuli. So in the case of classical conditioning, something that is similar to our conditioned stimulus, we respond to in the same way, or we respond to a similar reinforcement. And then stimulus discrimination shows our ability to determine the difference between two similar stimulus or two similar reinforcement. We're able to distinguish between whether or not this is the thing that should make us respond in a particular way. So let's have a look at the differences between the two. Classical conditioning is when the organism is passive, when either the conditioned stimulus or unconditioned stimulus is presented. But in operant conditioning, you've got to be active. You've got to be paying attention to receive the reinforcement or a punishment and be aware that it's happening. In classical conditioning, only involuntary responses are involved. Operant conditioning might involve both voluntary and involuntary responses. Classical conditioning, the response depends on the reinforcement being presented, while operant conditioning, reinforcement depends on the response being made. In classical conditioning, the reinforcer precedes the response, while in operant conditioning, the reinforcer follows the desired response. In humans, classical conditioning usually involves emotions like fear, while operant conditioning is usually about goal-seeking behaviours. So they've got a lot of similarities and a lot of similar processes, but they are also two very different processes that happen in human beings and also in other animals as well. If you've got any questions about any of these key parts, don't hesitate to let me know.